There is a phrase that diplomats use when a negotiation has quietly stopped moving. They call it a frozen conflict. Not peace, not war. Just a situation that nobody knows how to exit, and that everyone has quietly agreed to stop trying to resolve. I have watched frozen conflicts form in real time. I have watched governments convince themselves that managing a situation is the same as solving it. And I want to share with you what that looks like from the inside, because I think it is exactly what we are beginning to see unfold right now. The strikes on Iran's power plants have been postponed again, another 5 days. The same announcement, the same language, the same claim that conversations are productive. And I want to be precise here, because precision is what this moment demands. This is not a sequel to the first extension. A second extension is a categorically different event. And we will come back to why that distinction matters, because it changes almost everything about how we should read this situation. Before I explain what I believe is really happening, I want to acknowledge something that I think gets lost in the commentary. 88 million people live in Iran. They did not choose this government. They did not choose this confrontation. And every day that a power grid is held over their heads as a military threat is a day that a civilian population is being used as a pressure point. I will not let that disappear into the analysis. The human weight of this situation is real, and it has to sit alongside everything else we discussed today. Now, to understand what a second extension means, you have to understand what the first one established. And to understand that, you have to go back further than most people have been willing to go. This war did not begin in a vacuum. There were negotiations underway. A respected mediator, Oman's Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi, said publicly that a breakthrough had been reached, that Iran had made significant concessions on its nuclear program. And then the bombs fell anyway. The strikes came during active talks, not after their collapse. That is not a detail. That is the central fact of everything that has followed. Because when you destroy a negotiating framework while it is still functioning, you do not simply lose that deal. You send a message to every future interlocutor about the value of sitting down with you. And that message has echoed through every subsequent attempt to open a channel. I am not going to pretend the Iranian regime is without fault here. It is not. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz is economic warfare against the entire world, including nations that have no stake in this conflict. The retaliatory strikes on Gulf desalination infrastructure are threats against civilian populations in countries that did not choose this confrontation any more than the Iranian people did. I hold all of that simultaneously with what I just said about the origins of this war. Both things are true. And anyone who tells you only one of them is telling you an incomplete story. The IEA has described the energy disruption caused by this conflict as worse than both 1970s oil crises combined. 11 million barrels of daily supply gone. Let that number settle for a moment. 11 million barrels. That is not a market fluctuation. That is a restructuring of the global economy with consequences that will be felt in the price of food, in the cost of heating homes, in the margins of small businesses, in the wages of workers who never heard of the Strait of Hormuz before last month. That context matters, and it explains almost everything about what we are watching now. Let us walk through what actually happened in sequence, because the sequence is where the story lives. An ultimatum was issued, not through diplomatic channels, not through an intermediary, not in the language of statecraft. It was issued on a social media platform in capital letters. Open the strait within 48 hours or we will obliterate your power plants. Iran's Defense Council responded within hours. They said, if you touch our power grid, we will destroy Gulf desalination plants and mine the sea lanes permanently. not a proportional response, an existential one. Countries like Kuwait and Qatar depend on those plants for drinking water. No desalination means no water. That is not a military threat. That is a civilizational threat. The 48 hours passed. No strikes. The first extension was announced also on social media. Productive conversations were cited. Iran's foreign ministry said no such conversations had taken place. The White House did not clarify who participated, where the talks occurred, or what framework was being discussed. And oil prices moved 13% in a single session. Now the second clock has also passed. The second extension has been announced. The same language, the same absence of a named framework, the same denial from the Iranian side. Now here is where most people stop reading, but here is where it gets important. When I was involved in crisis negotiations, there was a concept we returned to constantly. It was a question of whether the other side could say yes without losing face. Not whether they wanted to, whether the structure of the situation allowed them to. Every durable agreement I was ever part of required that both sides be able to describe the outcome to their own people in terms that did not require them to admit defeat. That is not weakness. That is how agreements hold. When you issue a public ultimatum and then publicly claim that the other side is negotiating, you make it structurally impossible for them to confirm those negotiations, because confirming them means accepting your framing, and no government under bombardment, regardless of its character, is going to do that. The denials from Tehran are not evidence that nothing is happening. They may be evidence that something is happening, but cannot be acknowledged. And the distinction matters because it tells us something important about whether this pause has any substance behind it. Let me offer you an analogy that I think captures the dynamic precisely. Imagine a business negotiation where one party announces to the press before the talks conclude that the other side has agreed to their terms. The other side immediately denies it publicly. Both parties are now locked. The first party cannot walk back the announcement without losing credibility. The second party cannot confirm the talks without appearing to have capitulated to a press release. The actual substance of whatever was discussed is now buried under a public relations problem that neither side created deliberately, but that neither side can resolve easily. That is a structural trap that governing by announcement creates. And that trap does not get smaller with each extension. It gets larger. Now I want to speak to the institutional dimension of this, because I think it is the part of this story that deserves far more attention than it is receiving. And this should concern every person watching, regardless of their politics. We are conducting a real war with American service members in harm's way, with allied nations absorbing retaliatory fire, with a global energy supply in structural disruption. And the strategic cadence of that war is being communicated through social media posts. There is no publicly stated war aim. There is no congressional authorization. There is no coalition framework with shared decision-making and defined obligations. Oman's foreign minister wrote publicly in a major international publication that this is an unlawful war and a grave miscalculation. That is not an adversary speaking. That is a mediator, a partner, a country that put its credibility on the line to facilitate negotiations that were then rendered moot by the opening strikes. When a partner says that publicly, you can be certain that what is being said privately is considerably sharper. The Gulf states are in an impossible position. They cannot publicly break with Washington, but they are absorbing Iranian retaliatory fire on their own civilian infrastructure, and they are doing so while the strategic direction of the conflict shifts with each announcement. That is not an alliance. That is a situation where smaller partners are bearing costs for decisions they did not make and cannot influence. And when that calculus becomes visible to the populations of those countries, the political pressure on those governments will become very difficult to manage. Alliances do not end with declarations. They end with quietly recalibrated interests. And once that recalibration begins, it is very hard to rebuild. Follow the markets, not the missiles. When the second extension was announced, the reaction was the same as the first. Oil fell sharply. Equities rose. Every financial indicator moved in the direction of relief. And I want to ask you to sit with the arithmetic of that for a moment. The first extension moved markets by 13%. The second extension produced a similar reaction. Now ask yourself, who benefits each time from that market movement? And ask yourself whether a government that is watching those numbers in real time with political stakes tied to the economy has a structural incentive to produce that market reaction on a recurring basis, independent of whether the underlying situation has actually changed. I am not saying that is what is happening, but I am telling you that the observable pattern exists, and responsible analysis requires that we name it. Responsible leadership would acknowledge this tension openly, rather than presenting each extension as a diplomatic breakthrough. So let us think seriously about where this goes, because what we are watching is not a strategy. It is a series of decisions without a destination, and we owe it to ourselves to think through what comes next. The best case is that the back channels are real, that Turkey, Egypt, Oman, and Pakistan are carrying something of genuine substance, and that within this second window, a framework emerges that allows both sides to de-escalate without requiring a public capitulation from either. I want to believe that. But here is why it is the least likely outcome. Iran's foreign ministry is on record denying contact. The new supreme leader has not made a verified public appearance. The internal political dynamics in Tehran almost certainly make any visible gesture toward accommodation look like weakness at the worst possible moment for a leadership trying to consolidate authority. And Israel, whose strikes initiated this conflict, has spoken of regime change as an objective and ground operations as a possibility. A diplomatic resolution that does not include Israeli decision-making is not a resolution at all. It is a pause that one party to the conflict has not agreed to. The most dangerous scenario is one nobody wants to name directly. The second clock expires without a framework. The strikes on power plants happen. Iran follows through on its stated promise, destroying Gulf desalination infrastructure and closing sea lanes permanently. The humanitarian and economic consequences would cascade across multiple countries simultaneously. Gulf populations without safe water, a global shipping disruption that would take years to resolve, and the very real possibility of a conflict that expands beyond anyone's ability to contain, drawing in actors and triggering responses that no model fully accounts for, potentially irreversible. Those two words carry more weight in foreign policy than almost any others, because irreversible means that the decisions being made right now in 5-day increments announced on social media will shape the world for a generation. The most likely outcome, and I say this with no satisfaction, is a third extension, or something that functions as one. A partial gesture from one side, a humanitarian corridor, a statement of principles that allows both parties to claim a procedural victory while the underlying situation remains unchanged. The war continues at lower intensity. The economic damage accumulates. Gulf allies absorb more pressure in silence. American service members remain in harm's way with no clearer mission than they had at the start. And the public is told at 5-day intervals that conversations are productive. That is not leadership. That is a management of a situation that no one has a plan to resolve. I want to step back now and ask the question that I think this moment is really asking us. What kind of power do we want to be? Not in the abstract, in practice, and the specific, observable decisions being made right now about how this war is conducted and how it will end. I have spent a long time in rooms where those decisions get made, and I have learned that the way you end something shapes the world that comes after it, just as much as the reasons you started it. I began tonight with the idea of a frozen conflict, a situation that nobody knows how to exit, a management strategy dressed up as a policy. And that is the risk I see crystallizing right now, not the dramatic escalation, the quiet drift into a state of permanent low-grade crisis that everyone adjusts to, because the alternative of confronting it honestly is harder. The frozen conflict is the outcome that looks survivable in the short term and is corrosive in the long term, to alliances, to institutions, to the credibility of American leadership, to the people on every side of this conflict who deserve a real answer to the question of when it ends. That answer has not been given, and it is the one that matters most. To those serving in Congress, the authorization question is not procedural. It is constitutional. And the absence of a formal debate about war aims, exit conditions, and the limits of executive authority is not a sign of strength. It is a sign that the institution is not doing its job. To journalists covering this story, do not normalize the cadence. The third extension will be news, not a footnote. Hold the process to the same standard of scrutiny you would apply to any other government's management of a conflict of this magnitude. To the men and women in uniform who are executing these orders, your service is not invisible. The people who understand what you are being asked to do in a conflict without a defined mission and without a clear end state, we see you, and you deserve better than 5-day increments. To everyone watching, the frozen conflict is not inevitable. Course correction is still possible, as it has always been possible, when people are willing to demand the hard answers instead of accepting the easy announcements. That possibility is what I am asking you to hold on to, not optimism, possibility. They are not the same thing. Optimism requires no effort. Possibility requires that we keep asking the question, when does this end, and what does it end as? Ask it. Keep asking it, because the clock does not care about the extensions. It just keeps moving.